After he pushed the slide bolt home, Arthur sat down at the top of the stairs. He put his face in his hands and wept silently. It was the first time tears had flowed since Good Friday. He sucked in a ragged, catching inhale and rocked back and forth while the breath choked out of him and hot, salty water poured from his exhausted eyes as if his physiology was attempting to rinse away everything Arthur Keith had witnessed over the past days. At 3/4 past midnight, on Good Saturday morning, Arthur had been preparing for a midnight sprint to the latrine trench. His dysentery had not been acute enough to deliver him to the solace of a sick bed behind the lines, but it was atrocious enough that he had not excreted anything but liquid for days. He felt in constant, steady danger of soiling himself. When a fellow was 12 days away from a well-earned respite behind the lines, the idea of shitting in his only pants and underpants was a terrifying thought. Just as he was about to excuse himself from the becalmed artillery battery and its BL 60-pounder heavy guns, the telephone rang in the command hut. The artillery battery itself was on the east side of an elevated ridge. It overlooked the battlefield, but it was positioned just below the rise, defilade, thus hidden from view of German ground units and artillery spotters. Each morning before dawn, Arthur and his men used green tarpaulins and long branches of dead beech and ash to camouflage their ordnance, hiding it from the occasional German biplanes that spent their days seeking victims for the corresponding German heavy artillery on the other side of no man's land. Arthur did not consider it his job to rain hell onto German human beings. His job was to blow the matching artillery pieces across the way to smithereens. When he gave the command to fire, he was not sending 60-pound shells to kill men. He was sending 60-pound shells to kill machinery. The death of the men in explosions that turn the steel machines themselves into burning shrapnel, which forcefully dismembered nearby human bits, arms and legs and heads and cocks and balls, and immolated any bloody mass that remained, was entirely incidental. At least that is what Arthur salved his conscience with when he went to sleep at night. The phone rang again. Arthur bit his tongue and tried to still his clutching belly with his mind. He lifted the handset. Hello? The switch operator, sitting in a concrete blockhouse 3,000 yards away, was attached to Arthur by an extremely long piece of wire that had been patched nearly every other night when German artillery shells lucked into striking it. The operator asked Arthur to please hold while he connected him to GHQ. There was a momentary silence, and Arthur's stomach grumbled painfully. Then a stentorian voice on the other end of the line passed Arthur fresh targeting coordinates. Apparently some damnable German heavies were pounding the hell out of the Sherwood Foresters infantry, and GHQ wanted those bloody guns silenced, statum, and without further ado. Would Arthur be so good as to make it so? Yes, sir, of course, sir. Right away, sir, was Arthur's reply. Arthur hung up the phone and gritted his teeth against his ongoing intestinal distress. He hustled out of the tent and found Sergeant Russell. Russell woke with a start and stood bleary-eyed as he digested the information. Arthur cupped his flashlight, then flicked it on, revealing the penciled coordinates of the German battery's current whereabouts. Fire gun 1 for effect, a single salvo, and we'll see if these numbers are indeed accurate. Yes, sir, said Sergeant Russell. He saluted and went round and roused the rest of his gunnery team. While Arthur held his guts in, the men hove to, setting number 1 gun up for range and elevation, repeating the same basic action British gunners had been at from the day the first cannon had been fired at Crecy in 1346, to the hundreds of thousands of times it had been done on land and from the decks of man-of-war ships ever since. The only difference now being the rifled barrel of the artillery piece, the killing power of the shell's explosive blast, and the fact that no actual fire was set to a fuse when the order to fire was given. Sergeant Russell looked to Arthur. "Fire for effect, Sergeant," he said. Arthur cupped his ears. Sergeant Russell called out, "Number 1 gun, fire!" Danny Prince, number 1 gun's triggerman, yanked the cord. The ignition struck. The 60-pound shell flew out of the gun with an earth-shattering boom and an explosion of bright white-orange light as the barrel kicked back. Then there was only the ringing in the ears of men already half deaf from their labour. Arthur nodded to Sergeant Russell as the hot brass shell was ejected and chucked aside. Then, with as much grace as one can, Arthur ran for the latrine trench. He had his belt and buttons undone before he reached the log that hung over the deep stew of feces and urine. Even so, he barely sat onto the tree trunk suspended over the pool when what felt like all of his insides exploded out of him. Arthur's relief was painful. As he caught his breath, he chuckled to himself, surmising that his own personal artillery battery had just fired for effect. He was extremely grateful that the elevation and trajectory had been spot on and that no misfire had occurred. He wiped himself clean, then buttoned his trousers and headed back up the hill toward the battery. As he neared his tent, he heard the telephone ringing and hurried in to take the call. "Hello," Arthur said. There was silence on the line. "I say hello. This is Lieutenant Keith, Royal Artillery speaking. Hello?" There was a pause. Arthur could not say for sure, but it certainly sounded like someone was there. On the other end of the blockhouse, at the other end at the blockhouse switch exchange. "I say again, hello. Are you there? Corporal Devers? Billy?" Again, no response. But it was not the dead silence or cut line. Then it spoke, in what seemed 1,000 voices at once. "The anointed angel comes." The line went dead. Arthur held the phone to his ear for an excruciating moment of uncertainty and rising fear. Then he set the handpiece back into its cradle. He heard a sudden hullabaloo outside, shouts and cries from his men. His guts cramped again, but he ran for the tent's exit flap. When Arthur saw what was happening at the battery, he stumbled backward into the woods to hide. His men had been taken. Everything that happened after the demons lit their bonfire was stuck inside of Arthur Keith, filling his brain and his chest and his empty belly with sounds and images he would never be able to void out of his system. He watched his friend Percy Compton, a 20-year-old loader from Devon, whose stutter was as endearing to the listener as it was frustrating for him, get shoved down and speared. A pair of them held Percy up while a single blow from a sword cut his head half off. He heard the crack of the vertebrae as they pushed his dangling head backward and struck again with the blade to take it cleanly off his shoulders. He watched them twist his arms and legs wide, then hack them free. Then they bisected and butchered the torso. By then the bonfire was burning hot. They used the 60-pounders ramrods to make a spit, then set Percy's meaty remains to roasting over the flames. While their meal cooked, they spent the interim torturing and maiming the rest of Arthur's gun crew, impaling them on the branches of the dead trees they had used to hide their artillery battery during the day. Then the Imbangala hoisted them high in a wide semicircle. As grey dawn began to lighten the sky, outlining the ring of his men's limp bodies skewered onto stiff dead trees, Arthur knew he was next. He could not imagine any way to escape his little nest without being seen. His brain could not help repeating his childhood priest's communion pitch. Truly, truly, I say unto you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. And the looping refrain, combined with the cannibalistic visuals, was driving Arthur insane. The Imbangala finished the last bits of meat on Percy's blackened ribs and tossed the stripped bones into the fire's coals. They were admiring the skull they had carefully stripped clean of its flesh and tissue, meat and mealy brains, when Arthur made a break for it. The Imbangala's head man saw him. He cried out to his men, but Arthur's timing had been as impeccable as it was accidental. He screwed up his courage to the sticking point 2 minutes earlier. They would have run him down and killed him without question. Neither speed nor athleticism had ever been Arthur's strong suit. He was a methodical thinker and planner. So when he took action, it was a physical manifestation of intellectual study. It made him an excellent artilleryman and chess player, but would have made him a profoundly terrible front-line warrior. But his delay served him well. As the Imbangala ran after Arthur, the sun rose, and they all collapsed in lifeless heaps behind him, their dead bellies paunchy with Percy Compton's char-broiled shanks and flanks, brisket and bottom sirloin, ribs and bottom round, digesting inside them. Arthur did not look back. He ran on until he collapsed. He hid in the woods that night. From 5 miles away, he saw his artillery battery explode when Francois escaped the Imbangala himself and blew them sky high. Arthur soldiered on in a daze as dawn approached. He did not realize he had passed beyond the German lines until he came over the ridge and saw the vast German Air Corps with its Zeppelin shed below him. And then he heard it, the sound of men coming for him on the run, and Arthur Keith bolted down the hill, racing toward the dawn, tripping and stumbling, falling and sliding, looking back in terror, and again watching the sun's rise send his pursuers sprawling in lifeless heaps. And now he was alone again in his bunker. But Isaiah and Black Betty had stumbled into his life and brought him hope. And that was not nothing. He would prepare, as if their return was imminent, using his mind's gift for planning and making ready, so that when Isaiah and Betty returned with his air crew, they could move with all haste to depart into the ether. Robert Burns' poem rang in his ears for a moment. The best laid plans of mice and men oft go ugly. Arthur shook his head. Not this time. Not this time, he hoped. The she-wolf looked over her blood-matted shoulder to see if her little boy was there. He was not. She licked dried gore, last remnants of the day's adventure, off her silver and black coat. She had not successfully killed the men, but the anguished screams had their own satisfactions. They may have driven her off for the moment, but she would find them again and finish her work when they let down their guard. Of this she felt certain. She sniffed the cold air in, seeking scent, something that might entertain her in the meantime. As her brain instantaneously dissected the incoming odours with its hundreds of millions of processors, she caught a tender thread she recognised. She recalled the young Irish woman from the woods, where she'd begun killing men on Good Friday. She imagined how that delicate, pale flesh would taste, how the young woman's dark memories would spark through her while she devoured her. The wolf's salivary glands began to shed water into her mouth, wetting her tongue and whetting her appetite. Then another scent registered. The black man with the bloody ankle, a prime opponent ripe for the taking, despite the presence of his canine protector. The woman could wait. She looked back one last time for her young master. He still had not come for her. All in due course. For the time being, she locked onto Isaiah's scent and loped after it, disappearing into the falling snow.